This session is basically about taking apart the questions that you will often get in history papers. So once you learn how to take questions apart, you should be able to then answer any question on any topic. So let's just jump right into this so that we can be finished nice and early. It looks like someone is joining us. Let's admit this person into the group. All right, so let's just jump right into it. If anyone is having trouble seeing the screen, they just need to let me know. You can just unmute the mic and then just tell me if anything is going on. Right, so there are different types of questions that you will get in your history exam. They basically are divided into 3 categories. So you get the level 1 questions. Those are your easy questions where it asks you to list, name, or describe things. Usually the answer to a level 1 question would be found. Okay, let's see who's in the meeting room. Okay, apologies for that. It looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. You know, whenever you do these sorts of things, you get the technical difficulties every time. Doesn't matter how prepared you are, there's always these problems where your internet access cuts out or it starts to do these weird things. Please just be a little bit patient with me as I let people into the room. I don't know if you can see my screen share here, but let me just stop that. Okay. Alrighty. I would like to share. All right. Okay, so let's do that screen sharing. Share the screen. This thing. All right, so I apologize about that. I'm not sure what exactly happened there. Hello, sir. I hope everything's going well on your side. Nice of you to join us. So we're just waiting for this to load. So as I was explaining before, 3 types of questions. Level 1 questions would be list, name, describe. The answers would be found in the source. Then you get things that are referred to as level 2 questions. It would be questions where you will be needing to explain, identify, justify, basically to analyze the source and to speak about things in your own words. That would be let me allow this person in here. That would be considered a level 2 question. And then you've got your level 3 questions, which are your difficult questions, which learners actually tend to struggle with those quite a bit. It's your questions on comparing, it's your questions on contrasting, it's your questions on usefulness. Reliability is more or less out. They don't really ask questions on reliability anymore in the exam. So we won't be covering that in detail. And then obviously to what extent is the source useful? Those are your level 3 questions, your comparisons, your usefulness, and your paragraph. So a learner is basically guaranteed about 15 marks because 15 marks are level 1. So that's one of the good things. And then obviously the places where learners struggle would be the level 2 and the level 3. So let's just jump into a level 1 question. Okay, so firstly, we would get a question like this in the exam. So there's always that question, no matter which topic you do. So you'll notice that this whole PowerPoint is based on the topics that I do with my students. So you might not do the same topics, but you need to keep in mind that the way that you are doing the topic will always be the same. Okay. Hello, Anton. Oh, nice to meet you. All right, so
right,
what?
I want to see everybody with a pin in their hand and a pin out. Maybe if you check one, you will be marked absent if you don't have a pin. Anybody else that don't have a pin in the presentation and a piece of paper or a book? I'm not talking.
Okay, Mr. Janari, if you can just mute your mic, please.
Okay.
All right, so these are topics that I do with my students. So you'll see there it says define the concept reparations in the context of the TRC. Now, depending on the topics that you do, this definitions will be different, but every single source-based question will have definitions in it. So it's important for students to know their glossary and then obviously then apply what they know from their glossary to whatever the question is that they are answering. So in this case, we've got define the concept reparations in the context of the TRC. So let's break this up. Let's see the anatomy of this question. Firstly, define tells us that we need to give the exact meaning of a word. All right, so it's just explaining what the concept of reparations is based on the way that you have learned it in your glossary or the way that the teacher has taught it. And then you look at the concept. So the concept would be within your glossary, within your definitions. Sometimes if you are lucky, it will actually be in the source. And it's usually like in the first line of the first source, where they'll say something like, the TRC focused on giving reparations to people that were harmed during apartheid. Then you know, okay, it's something that the people that were harmed during apartheid actually get. So then they will say, define the concept. That means you have to explain. And then the word that is after that will be the word that you need to find the meaning of. Unfortunately, if you're lucky, it will be in the source. Sometimes it's not. But then the thing that always catches learners is this part here, in the context of the TRC. So the parts of something written that clarifies its meaning or the background. So what tends to happen in exam time, the child reads from define the concept reparations, and then they stop reading. And then they say, reparations is when people that were harmed during apartheid received money or they received something for their suffering. So then the child doesn't actually explain what it is in the context of the TRC, and then they don't get the mark. So I'll show you an example. So you need to write down the meaning of the word, but you need to consider the broader context or background, which changes the meaning slightly. So for example, reparations means the action of making amends for the wrong one has done. So that first line there is a plain and simple dictionary definition of reparations. However, the question is specifically asking for it in the background of the TRC. So you need to apply that definition, dictionary definition, to the TRC. So it would be the definition that you see directly underneath. Reparations in the context of the TRC is that the government is compensating or paying back people who suffered gross human rights violations during apartheid. So do you see the difference between just plain old reparations and reparations in the context of the TRC? So that's just very important to note, because sometimes that's how they catch you out. If you're lucky, then what they do is they'll just say define the concept, and then you can just write the dictionary definition. But you need to be aware that if it says in the context of something, then you need to look at the background. You need to relate it to the topic. A classic example, my students wrote something on Cuba and they had to define the term quarantine. And the problem is now with COVID, certain learners were placed in quarantine. So they wrote, when you're not allowed to leave your house. And I was like, oh my word, child. So in the context of Cuba, it wouldn't be that you're not allowed to leave your house. It was that Soviet ships were not allowed to enter Cuba. So that is how they catch you. They use the words, but then they say something like in the context of, and then you need to apply it to the historical topic, the historical term. All right, I hope that made that very, very clear, and let's move on. So now we get questions like this, the sort of comparison questions. These are level 2 questions or level 3 questions, and they are considered one of the more difficult questions to answer. And it would be something like, how does the information in source 1A support the evidence in source 1C regarding the deployment of missiles in Cuba? So the how means we need to explain in what way or manner or by what means. How does information in source 1A? So they tell you you must look at source 1A and then also source 1C. So they tell you exactly which sources you should be looking at. If you see the word support, it means you should be looking for what is the same. Now, I actually caught my learners out because I gave them a control test and I changed that word support to differs. And that meant instead of finding the things that are the same, they had to find the things that were different. But because they didn't read their question properly, a lot of them got caught out. So be careful, don't get caught out. Read your question very carefully. And then you'll see it is regarding the deployment of missiles in Cuba. So what this means is that you can't just find similarities, because there's probably lots of similarities. There's probably the similarities are that both were written by President Kennedy, or the similarities could be that both of them speak about capitalism. But you'll see there is a question focus. And the question focus is the deployment of missiles in Cuba. Meaning you can't just take anything that looks the same. You have to find something that is the same, but very specifically about the deployment of missiles. And that can be for any topic. You'll see that the way the question is phrased will be the same. They'll say, how does the information in source 1A support the evidence in source 1C regarding the impact of globalization, or regarding the tension created in Angola? So no matter what question you are, the questions are always set up in a certain way. All right, so how does the information in source 1A support the evidence in source 1C regarding the deployment of missiles in Cuba? So the question is asking you to find similarities between the sources. You only need to look for similarities regarding the deployment of missiles. So one of the reason I put that little box there is because my learners didn't know what the word deploy means. So the word deploy basically means why they put the missiles in Cuba. There needs to be a link between the sources. Without the link, you will receive no marks. So what tends to happen is learners don't know how to compare. So what they do is they just write anything. So they'll say in source 1C, President Kennedy talks about a blockade, and in source 1D, Khrushchev puts missiles in Cuba. So then there's no link between that. Like, you can't actually see what is the same. So it's very important that you use certain words to kind of clue the examiner in, or clue the marker in, that there is a link. So if you use the word missiles in source A, then use it again in source 1C, so that the examiner can clearly see that you are referring to the missiles in both sources. So I always tell my learners to answer this question by following this formula. You start by saying, in source 1A, it says, and then you find the evidence from the source, like maybe a sentence or so, and you write that in. And then you say, this is supported by the evidence in source 1C, and then you quote something from source 1C. Both sources say, and then you draw that comparison, you draw that link about the deployment of missiles in Cuba. There is a bit of an easier way to do this though. You can say both sources say, and then you make that link regarding the deployment of missiles in Cuba. So here you can see I've applied what I've just explained to you. This would be an example of a correct answer. So in source 1A, we've learned that the USA deployed missiles to Turkey and the USSR deployed missiles to Cuba. In source 1C, we see that both sides have nuclear missiles. So you can see I'm referring to source A, like the question is asking me to do, and I am referring to source 1C, like the question is asking me to do. And then you'll see that I've underlined the deployment of missiles in Cuba. And you'll see I use that word from the question in my answer. So there I said USA deployed missiles. So that relates. You can see the link. And then in source 1C, we can see that both sides have nuclear missiles. So there I make the link with missile in source 1C and missile in source 1A. All right. So this is an example of an incorrect answer. A lot of learners are very vague when they answer comparison questions. So it will be, they'll say source 1A speaks about the missiles and source 1C shows exactly what it's about. So why is this incorrect? Firstly, you have identified the correct sources, but you don't tell me what the source is actually saying about the missiles. You're being very vague, in other words. And then secondly, you say it shows what it's about, but once again, you are not telling me what does the source show, and you're not showing me how does that relate to source A. Right, so now we're going to move on to the next question that learners tend to struggle with, is with visual sources. So a visual source is very, very difficult to interpret because there's basically two layers to a visual source. The first layer, it's what you can see in front of you. But on the second layer, it's what is the message that is underneath. And getting the message that's underneath is not always easy to do. So you'll see this type of question would be phrased, what are the messages conveyed in the cartoon? The word conveyed meaning it's shown. You have to use the visual clues in the cartoon to support your answer. So what tells me that they are asking for information, identifying something. Messages is an idea that cannot directly be seen. Like I said, that idea that's underneath the picture. And then visual clues tells me that there must be something that I can see that tells me a bit of something about the message. And then you use that to support the message. So the question is asking you to identify something which is not actually there. It's not something you're just going to see. You need to look for the intention of the cartoonist. So, you know, if you draw a picture or if you take a photo, you have an idea of something that you want to portray. So I always use this example in my class where I have learners that will maybe go on their cell phone. And then I'll stop and I'll say, if I wanted to show that you are a naughty child, I will take a picture right now. And then they quickly put the cell phone away. So I have an intention to show that learner or to portray that learner in a certain way. So a cartoonist or a photographer or whatever type of visual source they give you, that person, when they drew that picture or when they took that photo, they had an intention. They wanted to show you something. So you need to ask, what is this cartoonist or this photographer trying to prove? What is his or her aim in making the cartoon? Please note that there is a second part of the question. So what tends to happen is learners only answer the first part of the question and they don't answer the second part. So let me just read the question again. what are the messages conveyed in the cartoon? So that's the first part. And then the second part would be use the visual clues in the cartoon to support your answer. So that's the second part. So the second part is use the visual clues to support your answer. You need to provide evidence from the source to prove the message. So you'll see usually questions like this would be 2 times 2, which is 2 things for 2 marks. So usually it's 2 things for the 2 marks for the message and 2 marks for the visual clue. So here we can see a picture of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. You might change your method of achieving the objective, but the objective never changes. Our objective is complete freedom, complete justice, complete equality by any means necessary. And that is a quote by Malcolm X. Then if we look at the picture, we can see that this person here is Martin Luther King. That person there is Malcolm X. You can see that he's got his little black power salute. And then you can see people in the crowd. They've got little placards that say "End tyranny, democracy, jobs, freedom." You can see in the front, you've got young people that are using Facebook and Twitter. And if you look at the crowd, you can see all different kinds of people there. There's a woman wearing a, oh, what do you call this again? I forgot. But she's wearing a headscarf. And you've got people of all different colors and creeds all watching Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So we have now, what we've just done is we've looked at the visual clues. So we haven't yet boiled down what the message is, but we at least know that these are visual clues that are going to clue us in to what the message is. So we can see from the text that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King have the same goal. The image of them standing together shows that they're being portrayed in a good way, and Malcolm X is using the Black Power salute. You can see that people are still following their ideas today, and you can see that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King have support from all kinds of people. So there is a sort of template you can use to answer this question. The template would be the message of the cartoon is, and then you write down what you think the message is. And then the clues that support this are, and then you take the stuff that you can see, right? So then that would be 2 marks for giving the message and 2 marks for giving the clue. Okay, so here we go. This is an example of the correct answer. The message of the cartoon is that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King are both fighting for equality and freedom. And the clues that support this are the fact that both are the focus of the cartoon, and there are people in the crowd that support them both. So you can see here is the message, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King working together. The clues are that if you look at the picture, let me just go back one. There they are standing together, lots of people are supporting them, and you can even use the text over there to support your answer. It's easy to say, not so easy to do, but if you are someone that is struggling to answer questions like this, I'm going to tell you a little secret. Oh, fantastic. Okay, I almost ran out of the 40 minutes, but then Zoom said I can continue. Yeah. Okay, so this is an example of an incorrect answer. So before I tell you the little secret, I'm going to tell you the example incorrect answer. This is not obvious from the cartoons. So if you look at the, let me just step it. If you see there, Malcolm X is overpowering Martin Luther King. That is not evident in the cartoon, because if we look at the cartoon, they are portrayed equally. So to say that the one is overpowering the other is just plain incorrect. And doesn't agree with his methods. There are no clues that support that statement. So if you look at the picture, he is literally saying our objective is the same. Okay, so you must be careful that your visual clues actually support the message. Okay? Right. So here's the little secret. So if you find answering visual sources a bit difficult, if you struggle with this, then it is enough if you can just write down the visual clues. Sometimes you can score 2 marks because sometimes when you write the visual clues, you are actually touching on the message. So that's just a little hint for the kids that struggle. Okay, so then the next thing that catches people out is the to what extent and the usefulness questions. So if you have a look here, you can see to what extent would a historian consider the information in this source useful when researching the influence of Steve Biko, and I made a mistake there. It's supposed to say Black Consciousness Movement. It says Black Power Movement. You can just fix that on your slide or on your page. So to what extent would a historian consider the information in the source useful when researching the influence of Steve Biko on the Black Consciousness Movement? So to what extent means that we have to discuss how relevant elements of a certain issue are. So in other words, is it very relevant or is it only a little bit relevant? So then we would say either it is useful to a great extent or it is useful to a lesser extent. The word useful is basically asking you, what does this source tell me? So after you have read through the source, you basically learned something. If you didn't learn anything, then that source has been useless to you. But you can always learn something from a source. So I always tell my kids that all sources are useful. So you need to ask yourself, after you've gone through the source, what did I actually learn from this source? And then you need to say, what did I learn about it? And then as you can see, there's that question focus again. So some learners stop reading where it says useful, and then they don't look at the question focus. So you don't need to speak about everything in the source. You only need to speak about the influence of Steve Biko. So you don't need to tell me if it's talking about SASO, if it's talking about the BPC, you don't need to mention anything of that. You just need to mention the aspects of the source that deals with Steve Biko. And the way the question is structured, it actually highlights what you need to look at in that source. I wrote Black Power Movement there. It's supposed to be Black Consciousness Movement. Right, so every source is useful, though some are more useful than others. The less details a source has, the more limitations it will have. So sometimes the examiner likes to throw you a curveball, and they ask that what are the limitations of the source to a historian studying the Black Consciousness Movement? All that means is that limitations is the opposite of what usefulness is. So if usefulness is asking you, what can you learn from a source? Limitations is saying, what is the source not telling you? Okay, I see there's some messages here. Let me just read this. The message could be that Martin and Malcolm use different leadership styles. That's also 100% correct. You could have used that, and then you could have used that little caption where they speak about their different methods and their different objectives as your visual clue. All right, thank you, Mr. Peterson, or Miss Peterson, I'm actually not sure. All right, so when it comes to usefulness, like I said, all sources are useful. But now we need to decide how useful is it. So then it says, what is more useful to eat a cake with? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Bing, 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 bing. If you guessed that the fork is more useful for eating the cake, you would be 100% correct. But does that mean that the knife is useless? No. The knife is more useful for cutting a cake. So when you look at usefulness, the question focus tells you whether you should be using the metaphorical fork or whether you should be using the knife. Okay, then the next thing I would like to deal with is that first part of the question, the to what extent. So therefore, when you answer this question, you would say that the source would be useful to a great or a large extent, or it would be useful to a lesser or a smaller extent. And then to determine the extent of the usefulness, we need to know the focus of the question. You need to keep the question focus in mind when answering the question, and therefore you need to focus on the influence of Steve Biko on, once again, I apologize for my mistake, the Black consciousness movement. So both of those ideas need to be somewhere in your answer. So you'll say the source is useful because it shows me that Steve Biko did this for the Black consciousness movement. Or the source is useful because it tells me Steve Biko started SASO. So there we're speaking about Steve Biko very specifically. And then the Black consciousness movement, we'll speak about how did he influence it? He influenced it by starting SASO. So therefore that would be our 2 marks. So the source is useful to a great or lesser extent because evidence from the source that relates to the focus of the question. So this is basically how you can answer this question. You can follow this formula. You start by writing the source is useful to a great or a lesser extent because, and then you go to the source and then you find what relates to Steve Biko, what relates to Black consciousness movement. And I want you guys to just keep in mind that I'm using examples from things that I personally, topics that I do with my students, but you can apply this to any topic. You can just underline that question focus and then look for things that are the same in the question focus and in the source. So this is an example of a correct answer. It would be the source is useful to a great extent because it shows that Steve Biko was the leader of the Black consciousness movement. Oh, I can't believe I made that mistake so many times. And this is an example of an incorrect answer. So the source tells us about the Black Power movement. Do you see how this answer is incorrect? Because it's not referring to Steve Biko, and it does not say the extent of the usefulness when the question very specifically is asking to what extent. It doesn't tell us about the influence of Steve Biko, and the way that they are speaking is too vague, meaning that they are not going into detail. So yes, you can say it tells us about the Black consciousness movement, but what does it tell us about the Black consciousness movement? You can't just say, it tells me about the Black consciousness movement, and then you don't tell me, what does it tell me? So you need to find specific examples from the sources. All right, and here's everyone's favorite question. Oh, my students hate this, and I'm sure all students everywhere hate this. But let's see if we can make this a bit easier for people to answer. So using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines or 80 words explaining how successful the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was regarding the reparations process. Now, many students see that and then they do that Ariana Grande song and they say, thank you, next, and they leave it open. Please never leave this question open. I'll show you, it's so easy to answer this question. Don't be intimidated by that 80 words thing. If anything, just cross it out. It doesn't exist. You can write as much or as little as you want. Okay, so using the information in the relevant sources, that clues you in that not all sources are going to be relevant. Some sources you will be able to use, but other sources you won't be able to use. Sometimes when they ask the paragraph question, they'll say using all the sources. Then you know you need to use evidence from all the sources. All right, so you will also have to use your own knowledge. So it's not enough to just use information from the sources. You need to also refer to things that come from your own knowledge. Own knowledge doesn't necessarily mean something that you thought up yourself. It also means things that you remember from class, but it's not in the sources. That also qualifies as own knowledge. Then you will see there's your question focus. How successful? So you need to know in your paragraph, you're going to be talking about the successful. Was it successful or wasn't it successful? And you're focusing on the how successful they were regarding the reparations process. So now they're narrowing in even more into the idea of reparations. So now you're not just talking about the TRC as a whole. You very specifically honing in, you've got your magnifying glass, and your magnifying glass is on the reparations process. So you're not going to talk about the entire TRC. You are only going to talk about reparations. And like I said, this can be applied to any question. Don't be thrown just because I'm answering, I'm using an example from the TRC. It can be on Angola, it can be on Cuba. It will follow more or less the same format. Okay, not all sources will be relevant. Maybe some of them will talk about the successes and others will talk about the failures. This means that you shouldn't use those sources if the question doesn't ask for it. Using your own knowledge is vital in order to achieve a full 8 marks for this question. Own knowledge is information that you have learned in class that isn't in the sources. If you find it too difficult to answer the paragraph question, what you can do is you can take 2 relevant facts from each source to construct a paragraph. Just keep in mind that these facts need to be in your own words as far as possible. If you just go to the source and copy paste, you're going to get absolutely no marks because then it is considered plagiarism. But what you can do is you can find facts from the source and maybe spruce it up a bit, put a bit of masala spice on. What you do is you can make it like, say, for example, they say the TRC's reparation process did not pay out everyone in the source, and then you can just kind of flip it around and say, not everyone was paid out by the TRC's reparation process. Voila, own words. So this is an example. In source A, it says that reparations were meant to help the victims receive closure. So it says that in the source, I've put my masala spice on, I've made it my own, and now I've got 1 mark in my paragraph. So please keep in mind that this question requires you to write a paragraph. That means you must not skip lines. If you skip lines, how many paragraphs are you writing? It's 2. So therefore, the examiner or the marker will mark the first paragraph and the second paragraph would be ignored. So you have basically wasted your time now writing this whole long paragraph, but now the second part is not considered. The second thing is you mustn't use bullet points because you get marked for structure. You know, you have to write it like a story, his story. You don't write it like you do in other subjects. I know in subjects like business, children have to write paragraphs using the bullet points. But in history, you write it like a story. And obviously, you'd need to follow the PEEL format, which is what I'm going to explain next. Oh, rewriting the sources as an answer will get you no marks. It is plagiarism. So don't waste your own time. I've seen learners that they don't know what to write. So what they do, they go to the source and they rewrite that entire source over. You know what we do as markers? We read the first couple lines. We say, oh, this is basically just source A. Then we just draw a little line on the side. We say plagiarized. And then you get no marks. So you actually waste your time by writing a full source over as an answer. So rather do that advice that I gave you in the beginning, 2 facts from each source. Then it cannot be plagiarized because you've taken 2 facts, you've made it your own, and therefore you can answer the question. When you answer a paragraph question, you have to follow the Peel method to get your full 8 marks. So you'd have to give a point, you'd have to explain that point, you'd have to give an example, and then you have to link that paragraph back to whatever the question was. So you'll see I've done an example here for you. The TRC was not successful in granting reparations. So there I've answered the question, how successful the TRC regarding reparations? They were not successful. So that clues the examiner in that the rest of your paragraph is going to be speaking about how they are not successful. Next, we have the explanation. Not enough people received compensation. So now we're explaining this is why the reparations were not successful. It's because not enough people received compensation. Then I go to the source and I find evidence from the source. That would be your example, your second E. Only 17,000 people were compensated. And then once you are done, you can then tie that back to the question and you can say, this proves that the TRC was not successful in granting reparations. Now, the nice thing is these E, we always call it the PEEL format, but that E and that E can be repeated as many times as you want. So you can give as many explanations or examples as you can possibly think of. To get your full 8 marks. All right, so this is an example of a correct answer. The TRC was not entirely successful in granting reparations to the victims of apartheid. You see the P, the point? They only focused on granting reparations to those who suffered gross human rights abuses, and everyone else did not receive anything. So you can see here, which source did I get that from? I got that from source 1A. Victims of apartheid felt that money was not being used for its correct purpose. I got that from source 1B. And there was not enough money in the fund to properly compensate everyone. And I got that also from source 1B. Many victims felt ignored by the government and the TRC. That would be source 1C. Over 80,000 people did not receive reparations that they were entitled to. That would be source 1D. Sorry, just hang on, I've got noisy kids outside. Okay, apologies for that. They came out of another extra class now. So then you can see over 80,000 people did not receive reparations. So once again, I'm referring back to this reparations. And that's from source 1D. Many people felt that money did not erase the pain and humiliation they suffered. That's also from source 1D. And this proves that the TRC was not successful. So there's my link, you know, that little line of argument that ties me back to the question. It was asking me how successful, and at the end I say it's not successful. And you can see that I have not taken a single thing of my own knowledge. This paragraph has been constructed solely using the sources. So everything that you are reading on the screen at the moment, I didn't think a lick of it up myself. I got all of this from the sources. And that's why I don't want you to feel intimidated by the paragraph question, because everything you need is in the sources. The only thing you need to be able to do is to be able to put that in your own words. So you replace words with similar words. So if they use the word unemployment, you use the word people lost their jobs. If they use the word pride, then you can say people were full of themselves, or whatever the case may be. So that's how you can make things into your own words. Play with your language a bit. But other than that, you can basically take 2 facts from each source, and then you'll have a full paragraph at the end. But remember, if you're aiming for that full 8 marks, you need to have just at least one thing that comes from your own knowledge, one thing that's not in the sources, but it's something that your teacher taught you. Now, this very particularly is about the TRC, but you can apply these methods to any paragraph question that you will get. taking 2 facts from each source, putting a bit of masala spice on it, and then just clearly putting it in order, explanation, example, etc., etc. Now I'm going to show you what an incorrect answer looks like. So this was an answer I got from a student on this question last year. And the kid said, source 1A says these measures aim to restore the dignity of the victims and the survivors. So immediately you can find a problem here. This child is not following the PEEL format. They're not saying if it was successful or not. And secondly, when they say these measures, what measures? Explain the measures to me. The measures that the child was referring to was obviously the reparations process, but they had to convert that into their own words. Source 1B says Brian Mafelele was tortured and beaten at Caledon Square. Okay, what does that have to do with the reparations process? And it's not telling me if it was successful or not either. So this information is not relevant. And then source 1C shows a guy on an island asking for help, but everyone is ignoring him. So that is actually a correct point. I gave the child a point for saying that. But the child didn't contextualize that. So they had to say that it represents the reparation process. People were asking for help, but they didn't get it. And then source 1D says that I never got a response from the TRC. I wrote out my whole autobiography for them. So that information has not been what we call contextualized. They haven't given me the background. How does this relate to reparations? And there's not enough information here to make up for those 8 marks. All right, with this, we are done. Before I move on, just to finish off, just hang on a second. All right, so before I finish off, I just need to explain that a paragraph question is not marked point by point. So a lot of kids think, 8 facts, 8 marks. No, you are also marked according to if you are following the PEEL format. Firstly, in your first line, you need to answer that question. Like you do with an essay, where you take that question and you turn it into an answer. Your paragraph is a mini essay. So you have 1 sentence that tells me how successful the TRC was. Then you give your explanation, you give your examples, and then your last sentence just reiterating, proving what you are trying to prove. All right. So we're not going to do the activity because I think it's a bit pointless, but the next meeting, when Lucille does the paper 1 and the paper 2, you'll probably do some activities mixed in with that. Right, so if there's any questions, now's your time to ask. You can unmute your mic and you can just ask the question, or you can ask the question in the chat box. Is there a type of question that I didn't cover that you want to know about? Please let me know. And if there's something that you want me to add to the slide, so a method that you figured out of how to answer different types of questions, you can send me an email, misssneft@gmail.com. And I hope this helps you, and good luck going forward. So I'm going to give everyone a few moments. We have about 10 minutes left before the end of the meeting to ask any questions. If there's no questions, then woo, we can go home. Okay, I see there are no questions. You can always just pop me an email if there is a question. Please note that in my email it's Miss S left, so there's 3 S's. And I think that is it for the meeting. Please note that the meeting has been recorded. I'll upload it on my YouTube channel, and then I'll ask Mr. Hugo if he can just make that available for everyone. I would like to thank everybody for attending. I thought I was going to sit in this Zoom meeting all by myself. I'm glad that that didn't happen. But thank you very much, and enjoy your day further.